Have you ever imagined visiting the city of love and finding yourself swept up in an unexpected romance? In today's story, we follow Daniel, an American tourist, as he ventures into the heart of Paris. What begins as a simple journey to explore the city turns into a whirlwind of emotions when he crosses paths with a mysterious and captivating Parisian named Alexander. Their connection blossoms amid the enchanting streets of Paris. But as their story unfolds, love proves to be as fragile as it is beautiful. This is a tale of passion, discovery, and heartbreak, a reminder that love can change our lives in the most profound ways, even if only for a fleeting moment. Stay with us until the end to witness the unforgettable journey of two souls brought together in the city of romance. If you enjoy heartfelt, dramatic stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss another emotional tale. Now, let's begin the story. A gay romance in Paris. Paris had always been on my list, a dream city, the pinnacle of romance and art. I had imagined strolling down cobblestone streets, breathing in the scent of freshly baked bread, and standing in awe of the Eiffel Tower. Now, at 33, I was finally here, hoping to escape the monotony of my life in Chicago. My name is Daniel Carter, and this trip was supposed to be a quiet escape, a way to lose myself in the beauty of Paris. That afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the Seine. I sat at a cafe on the Quai de Conti, sipping on an espresso that tasted far better than anything I'd had back home. Across from me, the Pont des Arts sparkled under the autumn light. Couples ambled across the bridge, laughing, holding hands, some stopping to secure their love with padlocks before tossing the keys into the river below. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider watching it all, like a spectator to a play I wasn't part of. And then I saw him, leaning casually against the railing of the bridge. He was the kind of man who demanded attention without even trying. His dark brown hair caught the light as it fell softly across his forehead. His jawline, sharp and defined, carried an elegance that seemed uniquely Parisian. He wore a black leather jacket over a white t-shirt, paired with slim jeans and boots that made him look effortlessly stylish, as if he had stepped straight out of a fashion ad. I tried to look away, but my eyes betrayed me. There was something about him, a quiet intensity, like he was lost in his thoughts yet entirely present in the world around him. For a moment, he turned and our eyes met. His gaze was piercing yet warm, and I froze, caught in a moment I couldn't quite explain. He smiled, just a small, almost shy curve of his lips, and then turned back to the river. My heart raced, and before I knew it, I was standing, abandoning my espresso and walking toward the bridge. As I approached, I felt the weight of my own nerves pressing down on me. What was I even going to say? Excuse me, or bonjour, seemed ridiculously insufficient. Yet there I was, standing just a few feet away from him. Bonjour, I finally said, my voice a little too soft. He turned toward me, his dark eyes catching the light. Hello, he replied, his English carrying a faint French accent that made the words sound like music. You speak English? I asked, feeling both relieved and embarrassed. He laughed softly. Most of us do. You are not from here, I take it? No, I'm American, I said, smiling awkwardly. I'm just visiting. He nodded, his expression calm but curious. And how are you finding Paris so far? It's beautiful, I said, glancing around but knowing full well I was no longer talking about the city. Better than I imagined. He smiled again, this time a little wider. Alexander, he said, offering his hand. Daniel, I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, warm, and lingered just a moment longer than expected. For the next few minutes, we talked about small things, the weather, the city, where I had been so far. Alexandra's voice was low and smooth, and every word felt like it carried weight. When he asked if I wanted to join him for coffee at another cafe nearby, I barely hesitated. "Sure," I said, trying to sound nonchalant while my heart threatened to leap out of my chest. As we walked side by side through the streets of Paris, I couldn't help but feel like something had shifted in my life. I had come to Paris to escape, but maybe, just maybe, I had found exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. The streets of Paris felt different with Alexander beside me. Every corner, every cobblestone seemed to come alive under his presence. As we walked, the late afternoon light painted the city in golden hues, and I couldn't help but steal glances at him. Alexander moved with a quiet confidence, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his leather jacket. "So, Daniel," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what brings you to Paris?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. "I guess I just needed a break from everything," I admitted. "Work, life, the usual. Paris felt like the perfect escape." "Escape," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "We all seek that sometimes. But tell me, are you finding what you're looking for?" I smiled, his question catching me off guard. "I'm not sure yet, but walking here with you, feels like a good start." He glanced at me, his lips curving into a small smile that felt almost private. "Paris has a way of surprising people." We stopped at a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the Marais district. The outdoor seating was intimate, with small round tables shaded by striped awnings. Alexandra pulled out a chair for me, his gesture subtle yet thoughtful. As we sat, he ordered in rapid French, the fluidity of his words captivating me as much as the man himself. When the waiter left, Alexander leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "And what about you?" I asked, eager to shift the focus. "What do you do?" "I'm an architect," he replied, his tone casual. "I design buildings, but more often I restore them. Paris is full of history waiting to be brought back to life." "An architect," I repeated, impressed. "That's amazing. You must love it." "I do," he said simply. "And you? What do you do back in America?" "I'm in finance," I said, feeling suddenly boring in comparison. "Numbers, spreadsheets, thrilling stuff." Alexander chuckled, his laugh low and warm. "It's not about the job," he said. "It's about what makes you feel alive. What is it that does that for you, Daniel?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. What did make me feel alive? It wasn't my job, and lately it didn't feel like much of anything did. But sitting there, across from Alexander, watching the way his fingers toyed with the edge of his coffee cup, I realized I might have found the answer in him. "I think I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that felt vulnerable, almost tender. "Sometimes you don't need to figure it out," he said. "Sometimes it finds you." The conversation drifted to lighter topics as we finished our coffee, but the weight of his words lingered. As we left the cafe and wandered along the Seine, the city around us seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of our footsteps and the gentle lapping of the river. When we reached the steps leading down to the water's edge, Alexander stopped abruptly. "This is my favorite place in Paris," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's where I come when I need to think." I followed his gaze to the water, the reflections of the city lights shimmering like tiny stars. "It's beautiful," I said softly. "It is," he replied, turning to look at me. but it's better now." His words hung between us, the air charged with something unspoken. My heart raced, but before I could respond, Alexandra took a small step closer, his presence overwhelming and magnetic. The Seine sparkled beneath the city lights, its calm surface mirroring the stars scattered across the night sky. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as Alexander stood just inches from me. His gaze was unwavering, intense, yet somehow tender, as if he could see straight through me. "This city," he began, his voice soft but steady. "It's beautiful, yes, but it can also be lonely." I swallowed hard, his words resonating deeper than I expected. "I know the feeling," I admitted. Alexander's lips curved into a faint smile, and he took another step closer. "But maybe," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "it doesn't have to be." The space between us seemed to disappear, the warmth of his presence pulling me in. Before I could think too much, I found myself saying, "You're right. It doesn't." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words, then reached out. His hand brushed against mine, just the lightest touch, but it sent a shiver through me. Slowly, his fingers intertwined with mine, and the world around us seemed to fade. "You're different," Alexander said, his tone thoughtful. "Most people I meet here, they come and go. But you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You're present." I wasn't sure how to respond. I wanted to tell him that he was the one making me feel alive, that his presence had turned this trip into something I hadn't even realized I needed. But before I could speak, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Let's walk," he said, his voice low and inviting. We strolled along the riverbank, the sound of the water lapping against the stone steps filling the silence. Alexander began to open up, telling me about his life in Paris. He spoke of his work restoring old buildings, his love for the city's history, and the way he found solace in its quiet corners. "What about you?" he asked after a while, his eyes glancing over at me. "Why did you come to Paris?" I hesitated, the weight of the question settling over me. "I guess I was looking for something," I admitted. "I just didn't know what." "And now?" he asked, his voice softer. I turned to him, meeting his gaze. "Now, I think I'm starting to figure it out." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt charged, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Alexander stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "Daniel," he said, my name rolling off his tongue in a way that made my chest tighten. "I don't usually do this, but—" His words trailed off, and I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. "Me neither," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The hesitation in his gaze melted away, replaced by something deeper, something undeniable. Slowly, as if testing the waters, he leaned in. The first touch of his lips against mine was soft, tentative, but it quickly deepened into something more. The kiss was slow and deliberate, filled with all the emotions we hadn't spoken aloud. The world around us disappeared. No Seine, no city, no noise, just him and me. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his breath mixing with mine. "That," he said, his voice a little breathless, "was worth the risk." I couldn't help but smile. "It was," I agreed, my voice shaky but certain. The following days passed in a haze of stolen moments and quiet laughter. Alexandra became my guide to the hidden corners of Paris, taking me to places I would never have found on my own. From cozy bookshops along the Rue de Rivoli to a hidden jazz club tucked away in Montmartre, every moment with him felt like discovering a new piece of the city and of him. We walked through the Jardin des Tuileries one crisp morning, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet as we wandered aimlessly. Alexandre seemed more at ease than I had seen him before, his guard lowered as he told me stories about growing up in Paris. His voice was animated, his dark eyes lighting up as he spoke about sneaking into the Louvre as a teenager or getting lost in the labyrinthine streets of Le Marais. I couldn't help but feel like I was seeing a side of him that few others had, a vulnerable, genuine version of the enigmatic man who had swept into my life. But even as we shared these moments, I couldn't ignore the occasional flicker of something else in his eyes. It was fleeting, but there was a shadow there, like a storm cloud just beyond the horizon. That evening, as we sat by the Seine sharing a bottle of wine, I decided to ask him about it. "Alexander," I said softly, turning to face him, "can I ask you something?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Of course." I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase the question. "Sometimes, it feels like there's something you're holding back, like there's a part of you I'm not seeing." He looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You're not wrong," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "There are things about me that aren't so simple." I waited, giving him space to continue. Finally, he turned back to me, his gaze heavy with emotion. "I wasn't always this person," he said. "The one you see now. I've made mistakes, Daniel. Some of them I'm still trying to fix." His words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. "You don't have to tell me everything," I said gently. "But I want you to know. You can trust me." For the first time since I'd met him, Alexandre looked truly vulnerable. He reached out, his hand finding mine, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." We sat there in silence for a while, the city around us alive with lights and sounds. I didn't push him for more, knowing that trust takes time. But even as I held his hand and felt the warmth of his presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was hiding could change everything. The tension between Alexander and me grew heavier with each passing day. While our moments together were still beautiful and filled with laughter, I could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. Alexander had always been an enigma, but now his silences felt louder, his smiles tinged with something I couldn't quite name. It was late one evening when the storm finally broke. We had spent the day wandering through Montmartre, visiting the Sacré-Cœur and lingering at a small café overlooking the city. He had seemed distant, his usual warmth dulled, but I didn't press him. I thought he needed time, that perhaps he was just lost in his thoughts. As we walked back to his apartment, the Parisian streets glowing under the soft light of the street lamps, I finally decided to ask. "Alexander," I said, stopping mid-step, "what's going on?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "You've been different," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ever since we talked by the Seine, it feels like there's something you're not telling me. I don't want to push you, but I need to know." For a moment, he didn't respond. He looked away, his jaw tightening as he ran a hand through his dark hair. The silence stretched between us, the sound of distant traffic and murmured conversations filling the void. "Daniel," he began, his voice low and strained, "there's something you should know." My heart raced as I waited for him to continue. "I didn't want this to happen," he said finally, his gaze meeting mine. "I didn't want to feel this way about you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, his expression pained. "Because I knew it couldn't last," he said. "Because I'm not who you think I am." "Then tell me who you are," I said, my chest tightening. "Let me understand." For a moment I thought he might. His eyes searched mine as if he were trying to find the words, but then he shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "Not yet." I reached out, my hand brushing against his. "Alexander," I said softly, "whatever it is, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." He looked down at our hands, his jaw clenching. "I wish it were that simple," he said. Before I could respond, he pulled away, his expression closing off. "I need some time," he said, stepping back. "I'll see you tomorrow." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone on the empty street. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the chill of the night settling into my bones. My mind raced with questions, each one more urgent than the last. What was Alexander hiding? And why did it feel like the fragile connection we had built was beginning to crack? The next day, I waited for Alexander by the Seine, the place where it all began. The minutes stretched into hours, the soft murmur of the river mocking my growing dread. Finally, I saw him approaching, his steps hesitant and his face shadowed with regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, stopping just a few feet away. "Alexander, please, don't do this," I pleaded, my voice breaking. He shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You deserve someone who can give you everything. I can't be that person." His words were final, cutting through me like a blade. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, his silhouette fading into the Parisian streets. I stood there, the weight of his absence pressing down on me as the city of love seemed to mourn with me. Not all love stories end with a happily ever after, but sometimes they leave us with lessons that shape who we are. What would you do if faced with a love you couldn't hold on to? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that touch your heart.